This time we're going to go to item 4 on the agenda. The first item on the agenda is the department's report on the 2021 annual use of force report. Can we bring up Captain Scott Williams? And I believe Assistant Chief Choi. Good morning, Chief Choi and Captain Williams.
Good morning. Good morning, Commissioner Briggs. Good morning, Commissioners, Chief Inspector General, Mr. T. Fink, and City Attorney Carlos De La Guerra. So let's see. I don't. Is Captain Williams up? I don't see him.
He is.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay. So today, what Captain Williams and I are going to do is present a snapshot of the department's 2021 year-end review on use of force. We're also going to discuss some of our use of force policy and training that we implemented over the past year. And this training and policy change addresses some of these trends that we identified in our use of force data in this year-end report. But before we get started, I just want to take a moment to publicly recognize all the men and women, the personnel that worked so hard to complete this report and make it happen. I think under the leadership of Captain Williams, Sergeant Eve White, and her staff at Critical Incident Review Division, they've really put together probably the most thorough and transparent look at police use of force in the nation. I just want to take a moment to recognize and thank them for their efforts. So at this time, we're going to try and share the screen and start the presentation.
Madam Secretary, can you enable my screen sharing? It's saying that function has been disabled for me.
Okay, try it one more again.
Okay, are you able to see that?
Yep, I think I see it, Commissioners. Okay, I see. So as we get started, Captain Williams is going to explain to the public how to access this report online. He's going to provide a brief overview of both the use of force data and city crime data. He's also going to provide the overviews of our categorical and non-categorical use of force statistics. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to briefly discuss some of the department's training efforts related to the use of force and mental illness. And at the end of the presentation, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have, knowing that we will be coming back on May 5th for more detailed response and follow-up. All right, so I'll hand it over to Captain Williams.
Great, good morning, everyone. So as of this morning, the department's use of force year-end review is available online at www.lapdonline.org. The report can be found under the Police Commission Quick Link in the section labeled Annual Use of Force Year-End Report. The link for the 2021 report is listed at the top, followed by a separate link for the executive summary. And one thing I'd like to point out about this year's report is that we have added hyperlinks to the officer-involved shooting synopsis section that will give them access to the case summaries, the Police Commission findings reports, along with the critical incident briefing videos for each incident. So in order to put LAPD's use of force in proper perspective, I think it's important to look at total stop and arrest data. So in 2021, LAPD officers had 1,324,535 documented public contacts. That's an 8.2% decrease in total public contacts compared to 2020, and marks the 4th year in a row in which the number of public contacts has decreased. Of the total contacts in 2021, 428,777, or about 32%, were officer-initiated contacts. That's 4% lower than 2020, and the 5th year in a row that officer-initiated contacts have decreased. Approximately 3.5% of all public contacts in 2021 resulted in arrests, and 0.17% resulted in a police use of force. And finally, the 37 officer-involved shootings in 2021 represented about 27/10,000ths of a percent of all public contacts. This data shows that the vast majority of public contacts, even those initiated by our officers, result in no force being used. Now we'll look at our crime statistics briefly. So 2021 was an unprecedented year in terms of guns recovered by our officers. The 8,661 guns recovered in 2021 was 33% increase compared to 2020. And about 22% of those were ghost guns. Ghost gun recoveries in 2021 were more than double those of 2020. Our violent crime numbers also increased in 2021. We saw an overall violent crime increase of about 6% compared to 2020, with the largest percentage increases being in homicide, which increased 11.8%, and aggravated assaults, which increased 7%. Violent crime arrests were also up 4% compared to 2020. Now, as we move into our categorical use of force statistics, I'd like to explain what categorical use of forces are. They consist of officer-involved shootings, including animal shootings, unintentional discharges of firearms, the firing of warning shots, in-custody deaths, intentional head strikes with a baton or other impact device, the use of force deemed to be deadly force applications that result in a subject's hospitalization, those are commonly referred to as LERIs, and then canine contacts that results in hospitalization, as well as any use of force the chief of police directs to be investigated by our Force Investigation Division. Now in 2021, there were 64 categorical uses of force, and that represents a 23% increase over 2020. And the most significant increases were in officer-involved shootings, which increased by 10 incidents or 37% compared to 2020, and unintentional discharges of firearms, which increased by 3 incidents or 60% compared to 2020. Our law enforcement related injury incidents were down 25% in 2021, while in custody deaths remain level to the 2020 number. Now we'll move on to a look at officer-involved shooting statistics. And I want to make a note that in the period between 2018 and 2021, it's been the lowest 4-year period of officer-involved shooting incidents in the last 3+ decades. Nonetheless, we're still very concerned about the increase in OIS incidents in 2021 and continue our efforts to reduce OIS incidents. Now, a few points to note about the department's officer-involved shooting incidents in 2021. 59% of those OIS incidents originated from a call for service. That's compared to 41% in 2020. 38% of suspects in OIS incidents were armed with edged weapons, and 41% were armed with firearms. That's statistically significant in a couple of ways. Despite the incredible number of guns recovered by our officers last year, the 41% of OIS incidents involving a suspect armed with a gun was the lowest percentage since 2015 and nearly 18% lower than the previous 10-year average. 18%, on the other hand, OIS incidents involving subjects armed with edged weapons were the highest they have been in at least 10 years and about 19% higher than the previous 10-year average. OIS incidents involving those experiencing mental health crisis and those involving unhoused individuals also increased in 2021. I'm going to be brief with the next few slides since I've already touched on some of these key points, but I will point out some important data. It is notable that the 37 officer-involved shootings last year, 26 were radio calls or citizen flag downs, and only 7 occurred during an officer-initiated incident. That's the lowest in both number and percentage since at least 2017. Now, I spoke about the suspect weapons and the statistical anomalies we saw in 2021. Again, we had a 100% increase in OIS incidents with edged weapons in 2021 compared to 2020. Of the 52 officers involved in the 37 OIS incidents, 42 discharged handguns, and 1 discharged a shotgun, and 9 discharged rifles. There were a total of 175 rounds fired during the 37 officer-involved shooting incidents in 2021. In 28 incidents, only 1 to 5 rounds were fired, and there were no incidents in 2021 in which 21 or more rounds were fired, which is the first time that's happened in at least the last 5 years. The result of that was the lowest average number of rounds fired per incident in the last 5 years. 38% of our suspects in OIS incidents were between the ages of 30 and 39. Now, this age group has consistently represented the largest number of suspects involved in OIS incidents. We also saw a significant increase in suspects between the ages of 40 and 49. But of note was the significant decrease in OIS incidents involving suspects in the 18 to 23 year age range, from 9 in 2020 to only 1 in 2021. As I had mentioned, subjects with mental illness accounted for 41% of the suspects in OIS incidents. But for the purposes of this statistic, it's important to note that the determination of mental illness is primarily based on documented contacts with the mental evaluation unit prior to the officer-involved shooting incident. Officer-involved shootings involving subjects experiencing homelessness increased substantially in 2021 compared to 2020 and accounted for 27% of all OIS suspects. It's noteworthy, though, that the homeless population in the city of Los Angeles increased more than 16% in 2020 to 41,290. And although the 2021 homeless count was canceled due to the pandemic, this population has steadily increased year after year for the past several years. The percentage of suspects injured as a result of OIS incidents in 2021 was slightly below the average from the previous 4 years. That is 38% in 2021 compared to the prior 4-year average of 42%. The number of fatal OIS incidents, however, was the highest since 2017 and significantly higher than 2020. It is of note, though, that the 7 fatal OIS incidents in 2020 was the lowest number of fatalities in at least the last 10 years. 65% of suspects in OIS incidents in 2021 were Hispanic, and 19% were African American, 13.5% were white, and 2.5% were identified as other. As far as our adjudications go, since not all 2021 OIS incidents have been adjudicated by this commission, we have to look back at 2020 to get a complete look at officer-involved shooting adjudication statistics. So in 2020, 39 officers received a finding for lethal use of force. Of those, 26 or 67% were found to be in policy. The remaining 13 or 33% were found to be out of policy. 39 officers also received tactics and drawing and exhibiting findings. Of the tactics findings, 23 or 59% received an administrative approval finding, while 16 or 41% received an administrative disapproval. Only 2 officers received an out of policy finding for drawing and exhibiting. I'm going to transition now into our non-categorical use of force data. In 2021, there were 2,248 reportable non-categorical uses of force. That was an increase of only 47 incidents, or 2% over 2020. And you'll see as I go through the NonCat data, the statistics have remained fairly consistent throughout the years. As we look at some notable statistics from non-categorical use of force incidents, I'd like to compare and contrast some of them to our OIS data. 61% of all non-categorical use of force incidents occurred while officers were handling radio calls. That's consistent with the 59% of OIS incidents that occurred during radio calls. 35% of non-categorical use of force incidents involved the subject experiencing homelessness, compared to 27% in OIS incidents, and 31% were perceived to be experiencing a mental health crisis, compared to 41% in OIS incidents. Now, despite the increase in OIS incidents involving subjects armed with edged weapons, we saw no significant increase in non-categorical incidents involving edged weapons. They accounted for only 2.4% of all non-categorical uses of force in 2021, compared to 2.1% in 2020. Since 2017, the number of officers involved in non-categorical use of force incidents has steadily increased, while the number of officers involved in OIS incidents has steadily decreased. Now, I believe this speaks to the effectiveness of the department's de-escalation training, specifically the concepts of planning, assessment, and additional resources. When our officers have the time to plan, they appropriately summon other officers to mitigate the need to use higher levels of force. And I think you'll see in the breakdown of non-categorical force options used that the vast majority are low-level, non-lethal force applications. As I mentioned, the most common force applications utilized by our officers are firm grips and joint locks, physical force, which is basically a push or a pull, and body weight. The utilizations of nearly all non-categorical force options have remained pretty consistent over the last 5 years, with the exception of the 40mm less lethal launcher, which has increased in usage as more of our officers are trained with it. 40% of the subjects involved in non-categorical use of force incidents were perceived to be under the influence of drugs and/or alcohol. Again, 35% were experiencing homelessness, and 31% were perceived to be suffering some kind of mental health crisis. 67% of subjects upon whom force was used either sustained some type of injury or complained of pain as a result of the force. While this is a significant number, it is notable that in less than 3% of all non-categorical use of force cases, the subject of force sustained any type of serious injury. Similar to our OIS adjudication data, there are still non-CAT cases from 2021 that have not yet been adjudicated. So in order to get the best look at adjudication trends, we have to look back at 2020. Of the 9,082 officers who received findings in tactics in 2020, 98% of them received an administrative approval finding. That includes assessments of de-escalation efforts. There were 28,436 individual applications of force that were evaluated and adjudicated in 2020. Of those, 99.6 were found to be in policy. Now we'll conclude today's presentation with Chief Choi discussing our ongoing training efforts intended to impact policies on our use of force. So Chief, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Captain Williams. Okay, so as you've just heard, some of the significant areas where we identified trends in our use of force data are our categorical use of forces with individuals with mental illness, as well as individuals armed with edge weapons. So some of the things that we've implemented and policies that we changed throughout the past year, I'm going to be discussing. So in our continuing efforts, number one, in our continuing efforts to reduce the intensity of encounters with persons with mental illness, we continue to train our officers on the mental health intervention training, MHIT as we call it. Currently, there's 4,676 officers that have completed the training. Obviously, we have a goal of having every field officer trained in MHIT. But in 2021, 90% of our officers that responded to radio calls were MHIT trained. And currently, our MHIT training is being held twice a month. Additionally, the department continues to look for and expand on alternatives to an armed police response when appropriate for those persons that are suicidal or depressed when there is no crime involved. The program that we use is with a diversion program with D.D. Hirsch. And in 2021, we had 1,642 calls that were diverted, and we're upwards of over 400 calls diverted already this year, year to date. It was also noted in the data that the number of 40mm less lethal launcher deployments have increased over the past 5 years. And that's because more and more officers are being trained in it as an alternative to escalating to lethal force without having another less lethal option. As of December 2021, we had 7,910 personnel that have been trained in the 40mm less lethal launcher. The training is ongoing, and we've also added an annual recertification, if you will, where the operator, the user will be asked to recertify or requal in that once a year during our normal shotgun qualification cycle. Additionally, training division has made some curriculum changes in an effort to provide officers with skills that will help them remain compliant with changing use of force policy, and also to reduce the potential use for using force. Some of these changes include an additional 25 hours of community engagement instruction that was added to the recruit basic course, where recruits receive instruction on cultural diversity, homelessness, mental illness, among other things. Additionally, the police science and leadership course was updated to include enrichment of crisis negotiation skills to help officers understand the neuroscience behind de-escalation to further assist in reducing the intensity of field encounters. Officers are also trained in tactical medicine, which is intended to teach them how to render aid to individuals in the field in accordance with Senate Bill 230 and our use of force policy. The field training officer update course continues to focus on de-escalation, mental health awareness, and command and control techniques. Also, following the Safe LA protests of 2020, the department is focused on enhancing our officer skills in crowd control and crowd management. So at the end of 2021, 7,986 officers have attended the updated crowd control, crowd management training. We also looked at some of our training bulletins and regarding the taser training bulletin and the beanbag shotgun training bulletin, they've been updated to address subjects that are self-mutilating and prohibiting the use of these less lethal devices if there's a possibility or probability that the situation may escalate to the use of deadly force, really essentially in emphasizing the concepts of distance and cover when using these tools. Also of note, we talked about the increase in officer-involved shootings with individuals with edge weapons. And in response to this trend, the department recently developed a training geared towards minimizing lethal encounters with suspects armed with weapons other than firearms by enhancing command and control efforts and accountability and really letting less lethal options work before escalating the incident to the use of deadly force. This course is titled Critical Thinking and Force Mitigation. It covers some topics such as giving commands versus having a conversation with somebody. It emphasizes rendering aid. It emphasizes fair and unbiased policing. And it also emphasizes the concept of redeployment and using your resources, such as the mental evaluation unit when you encounter somebody with going through a mental health crisis. Again, the concepts of distance and cover equals time. And if you have more time, you have more options. And just to sum all this up, all of our use of force training were guided by the principle of reverence for human life in every public encounter. This is discussed and emphasized in all of our use of force training. That concludes my brief presentation on our training and policy updates, but it also concludes the presentation. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you have for us today, knowing we'll be coming back on May 3rd for a more detailed follow-up for this commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Choi. Before I ask my own questions, I'm going to go around and ask whether or not any of the other commissioners have questions. Commissioner Bonner, do you have any questions for Chief Choi or Captain Williams?
Yes, I do. Thank you. And I have a list of questions, but I'll try to keep it to those that are going to enhance the review of the report that we've not yet seen. So that's the context of the questions. First is going back to the beginning, and this is on the concept of public context. And I think there was the number I wrote down was 0.17% of the categorical use of force resulting from public contacts. And just to clarify, does that imply that there's some other category of activity from which a use of force might originate? In other words, you're telling us that 0.17% resulted from public contacts. And so I'm just wanting to make sure, is there some other category of activity from which a categorical use of force might emerge?
I don't believe there's. I think we're just trying to show how many contacts we have each year versus how many of those result in a categorical use of force.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Bonner, that number actually represents the number of uses of force when compared to total public contacts. So what that number is saying is that in 0.17% of public contacts, there's a use of force.
Yeah, and just to clarify again, what I'll be trying to make sure I understand is even in those cases, one when I think of public contact, that might be calls for service, right? Someone may be calling some incident is unfolding. Another public contact might be officers walking a beat and approaching someone proactively and engage them in conversation about something. So that's what I'm trying to understand. Are those all in the basket of public contacts from which we're extrapolating the number, or is the second example somehow potentially treated differently?
No, sir, it's all encompassing. So those are all public contacts. And so it's of note that at least in terms of non-categorical uses of force, which is the vast majority of all uses of force that we had last year, 61% of those sourced from some type of a radio call, a directed activity by somebody other than the officer. So it was not an officer initiated contact, if you will, if that makes sense.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Commissioner Bonner, I think that Chief Moore also wanted to chime in before you move to your next question. Sorry.
Sure.
And just want to clarify as well, what they're doing with this presentation is we record field encounters where an officer completes a field data capture report. That and radio calls are included in that. Contacts that you may have in a jail setting, that you may have at a station house, those are matters that would not be caught in this. So that is that the number when you say 1.3 million plus encounters, in reality, there's many more encounters that an officer has or detective might have or others. For instance, working detectives in gang narcotics or working in fugitive. Those are contacts that are not captured in that numbers that you have there. We're just trying to provide the context, the vast array of public contacts that occur, and the number of uses of force would be categorical or non-categorical. But it does not represent, I'll be clear, it does not represent the entirety of contacts between members of this organization and the public.
Any guess on for those that it does not capture? Any guess on the magnitude of that? Is it a small reservoir of activity that's simply not captured, or is it potentially? And I'm just reflecting, say, on crime data, for example. I think it's always important to remind people we're talking about reported crime, when some would say almost 40% of crime is not reported. And so it's kind of difficult to know that, or it's important, at least for me, to understand that there's a reservoir of crime that is really not captured in some of the conversation. So in this case, for example, on the interactions, it sounds to me like a reservoir of activity, but I just want to understand, is it any more significant? That doesn't sound like it, but am I missing something?
So I think it would be, an estimation, a scale of magnitude. Say 30% of the workforce is involved outside, or 40% of the workforce is outside of a patrol unit or a geographic area command, and they have contacts when they deal with victims as well as with offenders and others. So again, it's a scale of magnitude here, 20–30%. It would be an estimation at best.
Understood. Appreciate that. Thank you. Next question: will the report have any data that will shed insight on the promise or potential of the alternative response? Chief Choi, you mentioned some of the data around the MHIT training, but as we were talking even last week about alternative response and so on, I think or at least what I discovered in that conversation, is that it was a conversation about situations about allocating resources or directing non-law enforcement resources to things that don't require law enforcement response. And that's separate from the question of incidents where someone does respond to an incident, encounter someone experiencing a mental health situation, and how many of those situations may evolve into use of force and the like. And it's that part of it that I'm trying to make sure that or understand if this report will shed any light on that category of situations.
Yes, this report does include some of those efforts of our alternative response.
Well, I think when I'm reading it, and this might be a better question to ask after we go through it, but will the report kind of, present a picture on of data that anyone looking at this issue of what's the potential of alternative response, how might it affect the use of force? Is that something that would be addressed kind of in the report, or is it something that someone would pull together information and kind of reach their own conclusion? Not a better way to answer the question, but that's.
So this report just hits on some of our efforts in addressing some of these trends, mental illness being one of the efforts, but a deep dive into our DD Hirsch is not what this report includes.
Got it. Okay. And then you mentioned, I think, in the introduction and also as part of your comments was some of the questions that I was asking before about this correlation between training, various types of training on the one hand, and the impact on use of force on the other. And I believe that's some of what you were addressing in your comments. And one is that's part of the questions there is to confirm that if that's what you were speaking to, and is that just your comments that are kind of overlaid on the report, or is just the report itself kind of speak to that as well?
No, those are my comments based on what is in the report and what the data shows us. I think Captain Williams had mentioned the number of officers that are involved in categorical use forces have gone down, whereas the number of officers involved in non-cats have gone up, which anecdotal, but it may show a success in reducing the level of force that is being used, shifting from the number of officers in categoricals to non-categoricals. And those are the types of things we're trying to draw from an analysis, not directly addressed in the report, though.
Got it. Okay. And then at least for now, for today's purposes, one other question is that in terms of the data, is there any data set that addresses the use of force in crowd control or unusual occurrence circumstances? So I know we've talked about, in a number of other reports before, that a lot of the data we discussed does not include the crowd control or unusual occurrence situations. But just the question is there any other data set outside this report that does that, or is that an area where the data is not effectively tracked and reported?
Well, obviously in 2020, that the uses of forces on a skirmish line were not captured other than on a 15 or a document that was reported to a supervisor. We do have, I think you're aware of the level 3 or the new use of force policy that should be published here soon, that will mandate the capturing and investigation of all those uses of force on a crowd control situation.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay.
Also, the safer LA reports, both from 2020, as far as the after action reports, as well as the outcomes of the safer LA complaint investigations, includes that information.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's what I have for today. There's one other question that I'm going to work in on the conversation of NIBRs that's coming up a little bit later. So look forward to receiving and talking further about the data that's going to be presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonner. Commissioner Kalanchik.
Thank you. Quick question, and then I have questions about this report. What is going to be presented next week? So I know kind of how to guide my questions. Is it similar, or is there like a follow-up to this that's going to be presented next week?
My understanding is this will be posted online, and Mr. Tiefenk, correct me if I'm wrong, but the commission will accept questions from the commissioners as well as the public, and then we can come back and address those.
So it's this report. Okay.
And that report, Madam Commissioner, will be on May 3rd. It will be back.
Oh, okay.
It will not be back next week. It'll be back on May 3rd. That will give all the commissioners and the public a chance to take a deep dive and review the report.
Got it. That would be super helpful. Yes, because I had so many different things I wanted to ask about. So I will just ask one then. Actually, two. So on the edge weapons, it was like 38%. I didn't see how many of them were fatal. Was that listed of the 38%? I don't recall the actual number, but is a report stating how many of those were fatal?
We do have the fatal number, Scott. I don't know if we have specifically just for edge weapon fatals.
Yeah, the book is not necessarily broken down that way by weapons, but it is certainly data that we have. And when we report back on May 3rd, Commissioner Kalanta, I'll make sure I have that information.
That would be important because I know there's like a lot of concern from the commission about the use of force when it comes to edge weapons, and something that we've been talking a lot about. So I think that information is super important. And then also on the edge weapons, I think what would be helpful, and I don't know if it was there because we saw a lot of data, was how many of those, the 38% were mental illness? Because I know there was a different category for mental illness. From my own kind of experience being here on the commission, I feel that many of those, without having an actual percentage of the edge weapons calls, do seem to have some sort of mental illness. And I noticed that the mental illness, as you explained, was more like if they had a contact with the MEU unit, right? So that would be important to know. So of those 38%, how many were fatal and how many we could say were suspects or individuals with mental illness? And I don't know if there's even a way to track that. But if, yeah.
There is, Commissioner. I actually do have, I have that data, as well as, because we looked at not only mentally ill individuals with edged weapons, but also homeless individuals with edged weapons, to see like where the correlations might be.
Yes.
I do have that data, and when we come back on May 3rd, I'll be sure to present that to you.
Perfect. And then the last question that was that I was looking for, I guess, data that I was looking for, of the categorical uses of force, how many led to termination? And I know that's listed somewhere. It just would be great for us to be able to see it. Yeah. That is all. That would be super helpful.
Yeah, no problem, Commissioner. I'll make sure that we look into that and have all that data you requested on May 3rd.
Chief, were you going to say something?
No, I think that's important that we can look back at 2020, 2019 for those outcomes, and any question that commissioners might have in the next 2 weeks is advancing that into Captain Scott will allow us, if it's not in the report, to make efforts to try to garner that and have it available for you.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate all the hard work. This is a lot of data. Thank you so much for all your efforts.
Thank you, Commissioner Kalanta. Commissioner Sobroff, did you have any questions? No? Okay, so I want to thank you, Chief Choi, Captain Williams, and everyone who worked on this year-end use of force report. As presented today, we see from this report, it underscores significant challenges that we still face. 41% of the officer-involved shootings in 2021 involved someone apparently experiencing a mental health issue. This fact alone highlights the need for greater mental health service providers in our city. It also serves to illustrate the reasons officers need additional training in this area, since not all of those OISs could or should be sent to alternative dispatch, particularly when they present an issue of public safety. Our department is further challenged when we look at 38% of the suspects involved in an OIS had an edged weapon. I've made no secret of my position with regard to how situations involving edged weapons should be handled. Commissioner Kalanta just touched upon it as well. You know, what we'd like to see is more de-escalation, then use of non-lethal force before employing lethal force in these situations. I am, however, mindful that no two situations are the same. I'm also mindful that when an officer goes out on patrol, one of the prominent thoughts on his or her mind is whether or not they're going to make it home safely that day or night. However, I firmly believe that we need to better train our officers around this issue. And this is one of the reasons why we, as a commission, have requested an increase in the department's budget to better train our officers for these types of situations as well as others. My hope is that the numbers presented today are atypical and will not be repeated. Any loss of life through the use of deadly force is horrible. We need to continue providing training for our officers, and I ask that all of the stakeholders in our city help with those efforts. Gentlemen, again, I want to thank all of you, your staff. The report is extremely comprehensive. I did have an opportunity to go through it, but I will wait, the period until we come back to do a deeper dive in it. So thank you for the presentation today.